can't do this. Don't make me do this. Except I love doing this. This is the group of books that I was judging for the Booktube Prize nonfiction semifinals round. These are some of the best nonfiction books I have ever read, and I had to choose 3 of 6. So let me tell you how I did it. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. In this video we're going to be talking about my participation in the Booktube Prize semifinals round as judging nonfiction. These are some big books, as you could see. Like, look at the, huge page counts. Now, in this group of books, I had 6 nonfiction books, and they all dealt with very different but also very interesting and intriguing and relevant topics. And so at the end, in order to submit my ballot, I had to split hairs. I'm going to say my top 5 books. Up to the end, I wasn't sure which of them was going to be number 1 and which one's going to be number 5. So there's that. But here's how I ranked them. So number 6 was the first book that I read. And I don't know if this maybe suffered from the fact that it was the first book that I read, the first book that I finished for the round. And so I was a little bit more distant from it. But this is also a book that I hope that more people read. This is Paradise Falls by Keith O'Brien, and this one talks about an environmental disaster that happened in Niagara Falls region in the 1970s. We're reading about a chemical company that deposited their waste underground, and eventually as the chemical started to leak and leach into the ground level, and how it started to impact this community and the people who were trying to make sure that this chemical company cleaned this up, but also that it didn't happen again. So this was really, really intriguing because I live in New York. I've lived in New York now for 20 years, and I have never heard about this thing that happened in Niagara Falls. It includes some real life lessons, like how regular people, when they're faced with a crisis, how they respond to it. Really, really enjoyed this, but ultimately I gave it my number 6 place. It was a little longer than I was hoping that it would be. It was close to 400 pages, and so it makes it a little less approachable. It makes it a little less likely that I'll recommend it to everyone, just because I know not everyone wants to read such a long book. So that was my number 6 book. My number 5 book is, surprise, surprise, The Song of the Cell by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Siddhartha Mukherjee is a doctor, is an oncologist, and in his books he writes about cancer and what everyday people should know about cancer. In this book he focuses on cancer from the cell perspective, but not just cancer. He's writing about cells. Well, the history of research on the cell. He talks about the people who first devised microscopes that allowed humanity to see to cell level, and how the research has grown since then, what we have done with the knowledge, and modern day, like right now, what we're doing with cell research, including stem cell research. How embryonic cells are removed from a patient who is suffering from some kind of disease, and how the cells are removed, how they're treated, and then returned to the patient, so that the patient now has this ability to fight off disease. And he talks about the success of that, but he also talks a little bit about the process of getting to that point. So this is the history of cells. It's an exploration of medicine and the new human. And like I said, he goes to this from different perspectives. I really, really like this book. But this was really informative, maybe a little too informative in some places. Maybe this could have been a little bit more approachable, is what I'm saying. So I gave this my number 5th spot, even though if this wins the prize, I wouldn't be upset. My number 4 book was The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris. This is a visionary surgeon's battle to mend the disfigured soldiers of World War I. This book highlights how the face of war changed. That's a pun if I've ever heard one. So in this book we are following the progress of war, focusing on World War I, the beginning of trench warfare and chemical warfare, how soldiers were being buffeted with machine gun fire in the trenches, but also chlorine gas. and the burns, chemical burns that resulted, and how a lot of these soldiers suffered facial deformities, um, and what facial deformities means for a person. So prior to this, I may have thought that plastic surgery was cosmetic, it was mostly aesthetic, mostly, not all, of course. But in this book, we really highlighted Fitzharris is clear to show the reader how the face is a big part of how an individual interacts with the world. It is where a lot of our sensory action happens, or our eyes so we can see, our nose so we can smell, our mouth so we can taste, so we can eat, how we can breathe, right? Those are not senses, but those are body functions. And so a person whose face is blown off in the war may not be able to, they mightn't look good, but that's the least of their concerns, even though it's also one of their concerns, because that person may not be able to be transported safely. You may put them down and they may suffocate just because they can't breathe. If the tongue is compromised, the lips are compromised, this kind of thing. So she really focuses on the horrors that were visited on the soldiers in World War I, and what this, we really focus on one surgeon, but there is lots of information about other surgeons who are working at the same time to help mend these soldiers' faces. I know I'm saying a lot about this book because it was so impactful. One of the things that was striking to me is that there are pictures inside that show the progress of patients when they started their treatment and when the round of surgeries was completed. And so we see, like, this is a really graphic one. This man, like, he's lost a big part of his face. So yeah, this book was groundbreaking. I really hope more people read this book. There were places in here that I felt like just sitting down and weeping, and that for me is the mark of a great book, because it really impacts me, even though, you know, we're reading about things that happened 100 years ago, but they were just like so vividly represented. So I know I went on and on about this book. It's still in my number 4 place, but I just couldn't. Anyway, my number 3 book was this one, Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino. This one is subtitled The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. And this is fantastic, and it's one of my higher rated books because I feel like this one is a must read. Like, this is a book that everyone could read and appreciate, regardless of what your political views are. So this may be a little polarizing, but this is about food. It's about geopolitics. It's about how our political issues have impacted how we eat and what we eat and where our food comes from and where our food supply is going, that kind of thing. But it also gives the history of these foods. I like how the book is presented. So the author takes a food, a single food, like kavilka, wheat, and shows a little bit of the history of the wheat. And then he shows how the diversity of wheat may have been changed over the years, but then he also shows a person, an individual, or a company that is working to preserve this variety of wheat and what that person's work looks like. And so we get that one after another. So I feel like there were places where the stories felt like they were a little repetitive, because they are. We're reading about foods, and we're reading a little bit about how the politics of our world and wars and famines have caused people or caused companies to do things to increase food supply, because that was our history. And so we see it impacting lots of different foods around the same time. And I feel like because of that, there were places where the book may have felt a little repetitive, but just because these things were impacting all those foods at the same time. So this book is just fascinating. It is an experience of history and culture and food and geopolitics, and I highly recommend it, even though it's my number 3 book. So then this one is number 2 for me, My Fourth Time We Drowned by Sally Hayden. This one is subtitled Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route. I'm an immigrant, so I am very partial to reading stories about people who are searching for a better life. I was never the kind of immigrant that is described here, because the people in this book are escaping persecution, are escaping wars, are trying to escape being drafted into the army of the country that they're from, drafted into fighting for things that they don't believe in. So we see people who are leaving primarily Northern Africa, Libya, but people who have come to Libya from other places like Eritrea. And we're learning a little bit about the history and the politics of those countries and why people's lives are the way they are, but also a little bit about what happens to them. So they get to a place where they can afford to pay a smuggler to take them on a boat to try to escape from Africa to Europe. Firstly, a lot of the people who try to make that journey on the boats, a lot of those boats capsize and the would-be migrants drown. That's the title. But then we also have these agencies like the Coast Guard that try to, They try to stop these boats and pick these people up and return them to Africa. And then they are put into detention centers. What should be refuge camps, but becomes detention centers. And again, they are taken advantage of in a lot of ways. And so Sally Hayden is an investigative journalist, and so she reports on this. As a person who's not a migrant herself, she's able to tell the story of many migrants, and so we see lots of different stories happening here. This was really intense. This is an issue that deserves much more attention. So I'm hoping that more people read this book. It's a big book, but it goes very fast because there's a lot that's happening and it's almost like you can't keep up. We see the Sally Hayden, the journalist herself, not being able to keep up with all the people who are trying to contact her looking for help. And we see how desperate their situations are, and we're able to follow along on whether or not these people get help, whether or not they get to their intended destinations. So this was my number 2 book, and so my number 1 book was Half American by Matthew F. Delmon. This one is subtitled The Epic Story of African Americans Fighting World War II at Home and Abroad. So World War II never actually was fought on American soil. So this kind of shows why African Americans got involved in the war effort, because for a lot of African Americans, war was here. African Americans for a long time have been fighting for civil rights, fighting segregation and Jim Crow here in the United States. Why they understood and wanted to react to the birth of fascism in Europe, and why African Americans were inspired to go overseas to help, even when the country was not initially involved in the war. So this one traces the journey of African Americans working for civil rights, for people fighting against fascism, but also the war here, the struggle for African Americans to even enter the military, to enter armed forces, because the military had an official report that talked about the inferiority of the Negro, why black people were not welcome in the military because they were cowards, because their brains were smaller than whites, and etc., etc. So this one follows, each chapter follows a different civil rights leader as they are working towards civil rights for Americans. So we read about Langston Hughes as he goes overseas and reports on the war, reports on the African Americans who are working there to ensure civil rights for the world, but also after the war, people who were working here stateside, like A. Philip Randolph, who was organizing the March on Washington, 100,000 black men they were bringing, and what Roosevelt's response was. We read about Thurgood Marshall and a lot of these freedom fighters here in the United States and what that looked like. So this, I feel like everyone should read this book, because this is American history that we probably didn't learn in schools. So love, love, love this book. It's my #1 book for this round. And so yeah, so I ranked them. So thank you so much for watching. Would love to hear from you if you've read these books, what your thoughts were. If I talked about a book here that you want to hear more about, because I tried to go fast in this video, even though it's long, it is 6 books that I loved. So I would be happy if any of these books emerge winner, any of them, because they were great. So it was tough to judge, but it was a great problem to have, because isn't it the best when you're just reading fantastic things? So thank you so much for watching. We'll be back soon with another video, and I hope you'll join me for it. Until then, happy reading. Bye.